There is a word that almost nobody says out loud in ordinary conversation. Not a curse word, not a slur, not something considered rude or inappropriate in any obvious way. Just a word. A plain, simple, honest word that describes the one experience every human being who has ever lived has either already faced, or will face, or has had to watch from the side of a hospital bed, or a bedroom, or a too-quiet house. The word is death. Try saying it in a social setting sometime. Bring it up at dinner, casually and calmly, as if it were simply a subject. Say, "I have been thinking about death lately." Watch what happens to the room. Watch how quickly the conversation shifts to something lighter. Watch the small, involuntary discomfort that passes across the faces of people who are otherwise quite comfortable discussing almost anything: money troubles, illness, divorce, failure, regret, politics, even the most private corners of their lives, but not that. There is a pause, a pivot, a gentle redirect, and then life resumes as if the word had not quite been spoken. This is unusual when you sit with it. We live in a civilization that has spent enormous energy, more than any civilization in human history, on the project of delaying death. Trillions of dollars of medical research, extraordinary technology, hospitals, pharmaceutical companies, surgical techniques, and treatment protocols that would have seemed miraculous 100 years ago. And all of it aimed, fundamentally, at the same project: pushing death back. Making it less immediate, keeping it, for as long as possible, at a remove. And yet, with all of that, we cannot bring ourselves to say the word in polite company. We cannot sit down with someone we love and say honestly, "I know you are getting older. I know I am getting older. I know that we will not always be here. Is there anything we need to say to each other while we still can?" Most of us reach the middle of our lives, and well into the second half, without having had a single frank, honest conversation about what happens when someone we love dies, or when we die ourselves. Not because death is distant. For many people watching this, it has been quite close. A parent, a sibling, a friend who left too soon or too slowly. The experience of death is not unfamiliar. What is unfamiliar is the honest language for it. The permission to sit in the room with the fact without immediately looking for the exit. This, in historical terms, is strange. It is genuinely strange, because every generation before ours had death nearby. Not as a disaster to be outsourced to strangers, not as a medical event to be managed elsewhere, but as a fact of daily life. Death happened at home, in the bedroom, in familiar rooms that still smelled of the person's whole life. Family was present because there was nowhere else for family to go. Children witnessed it, not because anyone made a deliberate decision to expose them, but because children were simply there, living in the same house where dying was happening. Communities had rituals for it, ways of gathering, ways of sitting with the body, ways of speaking about what had been lost and what had been. Those generations were not wiser than us in every sense. Life before modern medicine was shorter, harder, and more painful in countless ways. But they had something we have largely lost: a language for mortality. A practiced way of being with death that, if not comfortable, was at least familiar. Known. They had seen it before. And knowing what it looked like meant they were not meeting it for the first time in the worst possible moment. That language has largely disappeared. What replaced it is not a better language. It is silence, and a careful clinical vocabulary whose primary function is to keep the fact of death at arm's length. People no longer die. They pass away. They are lost. They leave us. Even in formal settings, even in obituaries and hospital consultations, the direct word tends to be softened or replaced. As if naming the thing too plainly might make it somehow worse. As if honesty were the danger. This is what this video is about. Not about dying in any medical or technical sense. Not about what comes after. That is territory for each person's own beliefs and will not be entered here. But about the silence itself. Where it came from, what it costs, and what it might mean to simply, quietly, allow the word back into ordinary life. Because here is the quiet paradox at the center of this subject. The people who hold death most honestly tend to be the ones who live most fully. Not the ones who are consumed by it. Not the ones who are morbid or preoccupied. But the ones who have looked at it clearly enough that they can stop letting the avoidance run their lives from underneath, without ever quite being named. This is not a gloomy conversation. Or it should not be. Let us see if it can be something else. To understand why we cannot speak about death today, it helps to understand that the silence is recent. Not a permanent feature of the human mind. Not some universal psychological law. It is a historical product, something that happened across a relatively short span of time, because of real and specific changes in medicine, in religion, in family structure, and in the way modern societies organize the care of the dying. For most of recorded history, and for the vast majority of human experience, death was domestic. That word carries a different weight than it does now. Domestic meant at home, in the house, in the same rooms where ordinary life happened. Death was not a medical event that took place in a separate facility managed by trained professionals. It was a household event, witnessed by whoever lived in or near that house. Neighbors helped. Extended family gathered, sometimes from far away, and stayed. The body was washed and prepared by people who had known the person in life. The vigil was kept in the same rooms where that person had eaten meals, argued with their children, grown old in the particular way that only happens at home. And children were present, not as a deliberate pedagogical decision, but simply because children lived in that house. They witnessed death, they smelled it, they heard the adults speaking about it, crying about it, praying about it. The experience of death was folded into childhood in a way that is almost impossible to imagine from the vantage point of the modern world. The consequences of this familiarity were significant, even if people at the time would not have thought to describe them in these terms. Death was known, terrible, and genuinely grieved, but known. People had an embodied, first-hand understanding of what dying looked like, what the hours before death felt like in a room, what a family looked like on the other side of loss. This knowledge was not written down in books or transmitted through formal instruction. It passed between generations through proximity, through being there. Then, across the 20th century, this changed. It changed because of progress, genuine, beneficial, important progress, and because of a series of secondary consequences of that progress that nobody fully anticipated. Modern medicine became extraordinary. The word is not too strong. Diseases that had killed people for centuries were brought under control or eliminated entirely. Surgical techniques advanced with striking speed. Painkillers became effective. Antibiotics transformed the treatment of infection. Infant mortality fell to levels that previous centuries would have found almost unimaginable. Life expectancy doubled in a few generations across the industrialized world. These were real and remarkable advances, worth naming clearly, because any honest account of what was lost must sit alongside a clear acknowledgement of what was genuinely gained. But one of the secondary consequences of medical progress was this: dying moved out of the home and into the institution. In the early 20th century, most people in the industrialized world died at home. By the middle of the century, that was changing. By the end of the century, in most developed countries, a significant majority died in hospitals, nursing homes, or hospice facilities. The shift was not universal or identical everywhere, but the general pattern was consistent. Dying became something that happened elsewhere, managed by people whose job it was to manage it. This was, in many individual cases, the right choice for the dying person. Hospitals can provide pain management, nursing care, and treatment options that a family home often cannot. The move toward institutional care was, in many cases, motivated by genuine compassion. Nobody wants their dying mother to suffer unmanaged pain in a bedroom because the family lacks the equipment or the knowledge to help. The intentions behind this shift were largely good. But the consequence, the unintended consequence, was that ordinary people stopped witnessing death. An entire generation grew up without ever having been in the room with someone who was dying. Without knowing, from direct experience, what dying looks like or feels like or sounds like. Without knowing what the people around them did, or how they behaved, when someone they loved was dying. Without the informal, generational education in mortality that proximity had always provided. And simultaneously, the professional infrastructure around death, funeral homes, hospital wards, hospice services, developed its own carefully managed language. A language designed, in part, to allow professionals to do an emotionally demanding job without constant psychological breakdown. It was a language of distance. The deceased, the remains, arrangements, passing, and this language modeled, for the families and friends around it, a way of referring to death that kept the fact abstract and somewhat impersonal. Meanwhile, religion, which had been, for most of the historical record, the primary cultural framework through which people understood death and gave it meaning, was losing its central place in secular life across Western societies. Not everywhere, and not for everyone. But broadly, across the second half of the 20th century, fewer and fewer people arrived at the end of their lives embedded in a tradition that had thought deeply about mortality. The old questions, what does death mean? How should a person face it? What do we owe the dying and the dead? No longer had ready institutional answers for millions of people. The framework that had previously held those questions had, for many, simply dissolved. And children continued to be protected, kept away from the funeral, or brought briefly and then removed. Told that grandma had gone to sleep, or gone to a better place, or simply gone somewhere peaceful. Given, in the name of kindness, no language at all for the thing that would eventually happen to everyone around them and, in time, to themselves. The result, accumulated across several generations, is this: a society that is extraordinarily well equipped to delay death and almost completely unprepared to think about it. The silence is not harmless. It has real consequences in the most difficult moments of real lives. Think about what happens, in a fairly typical modern scenario, when someone learns that they are dying. They are told, usually by a doctor, in a clinical setting. The doctor delivers the information as accurately and as compassionately as the circumstances allow. And then the person goes home, or back to a hospital room, or to wherever their life is, and the clock of ordinary life resumes around them. Meals are cooked, television is watched, family visits, phone calls are made, and everyone, by a kind of collective agreement that nobody explicitly chose and nobody announced, behaves as if the news has not quite been received. Or as if receiving it fully, acknowledging it plainly, speaking about it directly, would be more than any given afternoon could hold. The dying person, more often than not, participates in this. Not out of denial, though denial plays a role, but out of a kind of consideration for the people around them. They do not want to upset their children. They do not want to make every meal heavy with the weight of the obvious. They have been taught, by the same culture as everyone else, that speaking about death too directly is a burden, an imposition, a thing that makes people uncomfortable. And so the brave thing, the kind thing, as the culture has defined it, is to carry the knowledge quietly. To manage it privately. To let the people you love remain as comfortable as possible for as long as possible. And the family, circling around the dying person in precisely the same spirit, does the same thing in reverse. We do not want to upset them. We want to be positive. We want to protect them from despair. And so the thing that is actually happening, the most important thing, the only thing, the thing that fills every room and occupies every waking thought in that household, is exactly the thing nobody says out loud. The words that everyone most needs to speak go unspoken. I know you are dying. I am frightened. I love you more than I know how to say. I don't want you to go. Is there anything we have not said? Is there anything we need to do, or repair, or understand, before this ends? Those words often remain unspoken, not because the feelings are absent. They are overwhelming. But because nobody was taught the language. Nobody ever practiced sitting in that kind of room. Nobody learned, through any of the ordinary channels of childhood or education or community, how to be present with dying. And so everyone in the room reaches for whatever gets them through the next few minutes without everything falling apart. And the moment passes. And then another moment passes. And eventually the person dies. And the words were never said. This is one of the most consistent findings in the research on grief. Not an edge case, not an unusual experience, but something that happens with painful regularity. What people carry most heavily after a loss is not, usually, the simple fact of the loss itself. It is what was not said. The conversation that everyone in the room knew was needed and nobody could find the courage or the language to have. The understanding that was never quite spoken. Grief researchers speak of what they sometimes call complicated grief, the kind that does not follow the expected path, that does not soften with time, that circles back for years, that leaves people with a persistent sense of something unresolved. And one of the recurring themes in complicated grief is exactly this. The person left behind was not prepared. They did not have an honest account of what was coming. They did not have the conversation that would have allowed them to say what needed saying. The silence cost them that, and the cost proves to be lasting. There is also a practical dimension to this, less emotionally charged but no less real. The number of adults in developed countries who have no will, no advance health directive, no written statement of what they would want if they were unable to speak for themselves, is large and has been for some time. In many countries, a majority of adults have not completed these documents. Not because they are indifferent to the question, but because completing them requires thinking about death in a direct, specific, personal way. And the culture has trained them, carefully and systematically, to look away from exactly that kind of thinking. The result is that families are forced to make, in moments of extreme grief and acute pressure, decisions that could very easily have been made calmly and clearly years earlier. What did she want? Would he have wanted to continue treatment? What does a good death look like to this particular person? These questions, left unanswered until crisis, become sources of conflict and lasting resentment in families that might otherwise have been drawn together by their shared loss. But perhaps the quietest and most human cost of all is this. The dying person who cannot speak honestly about what is happening to them is, in a very real sense, a person who dies alone. Surrounded by people, visited, cared for, loved, genuinely and deeply, and alone. Because the thing that is actually happening, the central, overwhelming fact of their experience, is the one thing the culture around them has made impossible to name. And so they carry it privately. And the people who love them carry their own version of it privately. And they all sit together in the same room, and the silence between them holds everything that the language does not. Somewhere in the ancient Roman world, among the philosophers who spent their lives trying to understand how a person ought to live, there was a practice that looks, from the outside, almost deliberately strange. They called it memento mori. Remember that you will die. Not as a threat, not as a punishment, not as a way of making life feel grim or worthless, but as a discipline, a deliberate, regular practice of bringing the awareness of mortality into ordinary life. Some carried small objects, coins, medallions, sometimes a carved skull, that functioned as quiet reminders. Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor who left behind some of the most honest writing on mortality that antiquity gave us, returned to the subject again and again in his private journals. Not with despair, with a kind of calm insistence. He believed, and argued this view carefully over years of reflection, that a life lived in genuine awareness of its end was a different kind of life. A sharper life. A life in which the things that did not matter remained in their proper place, and the things that did matter were not perpetually deferred until some future hour that would never arrive. This was not a morbid habit. The Stoics were not, by most accounts, unhappy people. Marcus Aurelius, for all his meditation on death, was a man with great practical responsibilities, documented affection for his family and friends, and a life that contained, alongside its difficulties, real pleasure and real connection. His reflections on mortality were not a retreat from the world. They were what allowed him to enter it more honestly. The medieval Christian tradition developed a parallel idea. In the 15th century, a genre of texts circulated widely across Europe under the name ars moriendi, the art of dying. These were practical documents, guides to dying well, and to being with someone who was dying. They addressed, in careful detail, what a person should say, how a family should gather, what prayers would help, how to hold the hand of someone who was afraid, how to move through the hours before death without losing your composure or your faith. Death was treated as something that could be approached with more or less grace, and the difference, these texts argued, lay largely in whether you had prepared. Whether you had thought about it. Whether you had practiced, in whatever small way was available to you, the art of meeting the end with your eyes open. This tradition was not built on morbidity. It was built on a recognition that death, approached without preparation, is harder than it needs to be, for the dying person and for everyone around them. And that the preparation was possible. The skill could be cultivated. Not perfectly, not without grief, but honestly. The Japanese aesthetic tradition offers yet another angle on the same insight. The concept known as mono no aware, sometimes translated as the bittersweet awareness of impermanence, is at the center of a great deal of Japanese art and poetry and philosophy. It describes something like this: the feeling you have when the cherry blossoms fall. When a particular quality of afternoon light begins to change. When you look at someone you love and understand, in your body rather than just in your mind, that this moment will not always be here. Mono no aware is not despair. It is a kind of heightened presence, a charged awareness that comes from knowing that things pass. The cherry blossom is beautiful partly because it falls. The afternoon is precious partly because the light changes. The awareness of an ending deepens, rather than diminishes, the experience of being present. These are very different traditions, arising from very different places, shaped by very different beliefs about what life means and what comes after. But they share something worth holding onto. The conviction that holding mortality honestly is not a way of diminishing life. It is a way of taking it seriously, a way of meeting it with the attention it deserves. And then the modern world arrived, in its extraordinary and genuine compassion, and offered a different arrangement. You do not have to think about this anymore. We will manage it. We will take the dying to places where it can be handled by trained professionals. We will give you language that softens the fact until it barely registers. We will protect your children from any contact with it. You can live, for as long as possible, as if the ending simply were not there. The result, accumulated across several generations of this arrangement, is a kind of widespread, low-level existential anxiety that is never quite named. Because to name it would require engaging with what it is actually about. A persistent background unease, a restlessness beneath the surface of ordinary life. A vague sense that something important has not been dealt with, something that presses lightly upward without ever quite finding a way out. The psychologist Irvin Yalom spent much of his career working with patients who were confronting mortality, their own or someone close to them, and he returned, across many books and many decades of clinical work, to the same observation. Most people, when they are finally allowed or required to confront their own mortality honestly, do not collapse into terror. Many of them feel something closer to relief. The relief of having named something that had been present all along, pressing from underneath without a name. The relief of finally being in honest contact with the actual situation. This is what tends to happen when the silence breaks. Not darkness arriving, something more like, oh, so that is what this was. And there is one more dimension here that deserves to be said carefully. Many of the older people in our lives, parents, grandparents, older friends, relatives who are now in their 70s and 80s, are carrying thoughts about death that they cannot easily share. Not because they are consumed by fear. Many of them have arrived, through the particular education that comes with age and loss, at a quiet and genuinely thoughtful relationship with the fact of mortality. They have things to say about it, questions they have sat with, a kind of understanding that only comes from having lived long enough to see how things end, and what the approach to an ending looks like from the inside. But the culture around them has made the topic seem like a burden. A thing that would upset the younger people. A thing that would make people think something was wrong, or that there was bad news, or that things had taken a darker turn. And so they hold it quietly, sometimes for years. The thoughts and the understanding and, sometimes, the things they most want to say, held in private, because the people around them are still, somehow, not quite ready for the conversation. This is one of the quieter losses of the way we have arranged modern life. Not dramatic, not visible from the outside, just the distance between what is being carried and what can be said. Between the wisdom that comes with age and the culture's inability to make room for it. Nothing in this conversation is meant as a suggestion to become preoccupied with death. Not to make every gathering spiral toward metaphysics. Not to force the subject on people who are not ready for it, or to push into territory that is genuinely private and belongs to each person on their own terms. Not to make ordinary life heavy, or to treat every moment as an opportunity for philosophical reckoning. What is being suggested is something much quieter and much smaller than that. Simply this: that death is not a subject to be avoided. That it is, when approached honestly and without drama, one of the most humanizing subjects there is. That the conversations about it, carefully, with the right people, at the right moments, tend to make life better rather than worse. That the silence, for all that it feels like a form of protection, has actually been costing something. And that what it has been costing is not abstract. The evidence here is consistent across a range of research and a range of human experience. People who have explicitly thought about their own death, who have made arrangements, written down their wishes, had honest conversations with the people they love about what a good death would look like for them, consistently report that the process was not as frightening as they had expected. It was clarifying. It helped them understand what they actually valued, as opposed to what they assumed they valued. It removed a background anxiety that they had not quite acknowledged was there until it was gone. People who choose to be present with someone who is dying, who stay in the room rather than retreating to somewhere more comfortable, who let themselves witness the experience rather than finding an errand to run, often describe it, later, as one of the most significant experiences of their lives. Not the most pleasant, not the easiest, but one of the most real, because it asked something genuine of them, and they discovered they were capable of meeting the moment without falling apart. That discovery, the discovery of one's own capacity to be present with difficulty, tends to stay with people in a quiet and sustaining way. And people who have the honest conversation, with an aging parent, or a seriously ill friend, or someone they love who is approaching the end, who say the things that need to be said while there is still time and breath and clarity to say them, almost never regret having done so. The conversation was difficult. In some cases, it was among the hardest things they had ever done. But the alternative, the conversation that did not happen, the words that were left in the chest until it was too late, would have been far heavier to carry. None of this requires very much. It does not require a dramatic change in how you live. It does not require a meditation practice, or a philosophy degree, or a change in your beliefs about what comes after this life. It requires only a small, quiet willingness. The willingness to let the word exist in ordinary conversation. To occasionally, without panic and without performance, acknowledge the fact that life ends. That the people around you will not always be here. That you yourself will not always be here. And that this fact, held honestly, is not an enemy, it is a teacher. In the old philosophical traditions, the person who had developed this honest relationship with mortality was sometimes described in terms that modern ears might find unusual. A person who, in a sense, lived backward from their death. Not in a gloomy way. Not in a way that made them sad or strange to be around. But in the sense that they had done the calculation consciously, and arrived at their daily choices from that awareness. They knew what mattered because they had been honest about what ended. And knowing what ended gave them a quality of presence and clarity that people who had avoided the calculation often seemed to lack. Maybe that is the real cost of the silence, in the end. Not the missing rituals, though they mattered. Not the euphemistic language, though it does its own kind of harm. Not even the conversations that did not happen, though those carry weight that lasts. But something harder to name. The quiet freedom of a person who has looked honestly at their own life, at what it has been, at what it still might be, at what it is heading toward, and decided, with some clarity, what to do with the time they have. That freedom is still available. It has not been lost. It begins with something as small as allowing the word into an ordinary sentence. Letting it exist without immediately reaching for the redirect. Saying, in whatever way feels true, I know this is real. I am not going to spend my best years pretending otherwise. And perhaps, when the moment comes, finding the language to say to the people who matter most, while I am here, while we are both here, let me not leave things unsaid. That is not a preparation for dying. That is a way of being alive.